Because after all that, after going through the botany, the ancient civilizations, the Industrial Revolution, the aura collapsing sweaters, and whatever exactly was going on with that polyester conspiracy, we have somehow found our way back to exactly where we started. What exactly is cotton? Because after spending days researching it, reading papers, chasing references, making a 3-part mini-series, and disappearing into increasingly concerning corners of the internet, I realized something mildly ridiculous. I've been talking for well over an hour at this point, and I still haven't actually clarified what all the different kinds of cotton are. We've only just accepted that they're different, very different. We've already followed it across continents, folklore, factories, spin cycles, and we still haven't really actually gotten a satisfying answer to the question that has every knitter up in arms about whether or not they like cotton. I mean, I had a tinfoil hat on. And somehow, we still have not answered the simplest question. When somebody walks into a yarn store and they pick up 2 different cakes of cotton and they both say 100%, yet they somehow feel completely different. One is so soft and drapey, the other is so crisp and shiny. And then there's another one over there that looks a little bit like rope. And then another one so smooth you can barely believe it's cotton at all. Because this is quite literally the thing we've been saying since part 1. Cotton is not just one thing. And we've repeated that sentence several times now without any clarification. So, I think it's time we do that. What are all the different types of cotton? And perhaps more importantly to us, what difference does any of it actually make when we put it on our needles? Chapter 8, the different types of cotton. So first things first, there are literally different kinds of cotton plants. And this is probably the best place to start. There are actually 4 major cultivated plants under the cotton species. And they don't all produce the same type of fiber. The one doing most of the heavy lifting today is called Gossypium hirsutum, or much less Latin-y, upland cotton. This one is basically the powerhouse, the workhorse of the cotton world. It takes up an overwhelming majority of the cotton that is grown and produced and sold today. It's the cotton most likely to turn up in the everyday things around us. I'm talking about t-shirts, jeans, towels, or like household fabrics. And more frequently, the kind of cotton you're going to come across sitting on a shelf in a yarn store. I'm referring to that everyday cotton. Its fibers are generally a medium to long staple length. Staple length just refers to the actual length of the fiber, but that word staple is going to become very important later. For now, you can just file it as fiber length. Upland cotton tends to have a shorter fiber than some of the more luxurious blends that, say, we've encountered, that we look at and we go, is this cotton? But that does not mean that upland automatically means cheap or scratchy or bad. There can be a huge difference in quality even in the same species. Upland simply tells us which cotton plant we're now working with. Next up in our list, we have Gossypium barbadens. And this is where things start to get a little bit fancy, because this one is the one behind the labels that have the very ostentatious printing. You know what I'm talking about when you go into a bedding store or that boutique or a very high-end fiber store. You're gonna see it when you see names like Prima Egyptian cotton and Sea Island cotton. That sounds quite nice, actually. And this is where marketing has made everything a little more confusing than it needs to be, because those are not necessarily 3 different kinds of cotton. They are simply names connected to different histories, places, growing traditions, and varieties, all within the same broader species. And Gossibadi, we're going to call her now, Gossibadi is famous for producing exceptionally long fiber lengths. Very fine, very soft. Which changes almost everything about what we're now able to do with it. Remember that each cotton fiber is only a tiny little hair. If those hairs are longer, they overlap a little bit more readily when spinning, and they just become a lot easier to handle. This basically means that the resulting yarns can be a lot smoother, stronger, less fuzzy, frequently softer, and capable of producing a more fluid fabric. So this is why when someone picks up a ball of Prima cotton and they think to themselves, I thought cotton was stiff. They may technically be holding the exact same fabric as your basic kitchen towel, a cellulose, cotton, plant fiber, but now the raw material itself is very different. It's almost like comparing a coarse Shetland wool with like a super fine merino and being confused that they don't feel the same. They are both wool, but that doesn't make them interchangeable. And cotton works very much the same way. Then there's the last two species, which, to be honest, we're very unlikely to ever really meet in a yarn store. Gossi arboreum, we call this one tree cotton, thank God, and Gossypium herbaceum, sometimes called Levant or African cotton. These are older, more domesticated species from the old world. Their fibers tend to be much shorter and coarser than any of the cotton that has since dominated the commercial industry, which does explain why we hear much less about them today. But historically, they were very important because they bring us straight back to something we discovered earlier in this series. Cotton does not have one little neat origin story. Different people in different parts of the world domesticated different kinds of cotton, independently. That thing that I find so incredibly fascinating. People were looking at very different varieties of cotton worlds apart, and they all arrived at the same conclusion. Yes, I can turn that fluff into clothes. And that means before we've even talked about spinning, plying, mercerizing, we already have different cotton plants with all different fiber lengths. And these are going to have different qualities and different histories. And yet, by the time each of them are turned into a skein and a little label is slapped on them, they're all still going to say 100% cotton, which now explains to us why that label isn't really helping us out. Next we can start discussing staple length. This is going to really help you understand cotton because, when you pull on your yarn, it looks like it's all one continuous thing, right? It isn't. That strand is made from thousands, if not more, little tiny cotton fibers all put together. And every one of those little fibers has an end. The distance from the one end to the other end is called your staple length. It sounds like a little distinction that's not all that important, but it actually completely changes the way that yarn behaves when you knit with it. You can imagine trying to make a rope from lots of tiny little pieces of string. You would need plenty of twist to hold everything together, and you'd have a lot of little ends trying to escape along the way. Give yourself a much longer piece of string, and suddenly they're capable of overlapping a lot more easily. Cotton works in a very similar way. Longer cotton fibers overlap a lot more effectively when they're being spun, which allows them to be made into yarns that are a lot smoother and a lot finer and a lot stronger without needing to be bulky. And because that surface is now smoother, light's going to reflect from it differently, giving high quality, long staple length cotton some of the most beautiful natural luster that we associate with things like Prima cotton and other luxury cotton brands. And at the shorter end of the spectrum, more fuzz, more rustic, and that's going to be a yarn that's better off being spun into like a thicker strand. Which kind of brings us to something that several of you mentioned in part 1, kitchen cotton. I've developed a conclusion that kitchen cotton may well be responsible for this terrible reputation that cotton has. Because if your very first experience with cotton was working with something that was meant to be a utilitarian fabric cloth, and then someone comes along and hands you a ball of Prima cotton, those two yarns can feel like they have absolutely nothing in common. And yet they both will tell you they have 100% cotton on the label. And we haven't even spun the cotton yet. We've only talked about different plant species, different stable lengths, but that's not for now. Next, we need to discuss fiber fineness and maturity, because cotton hasn't given us enough variables yet. Much like baby alpaca or alpaca, the fineness of the cotton matters a lot to the manufacturers. They also care quite a lot about how fully they matured while they were still growing on the plant. One of the measurements you'll come across here is called a Micronaire, which sounds like a tiny millionaire or maybe some sort of futuristic skincare routine, but it is actually the measurement of how fine and how mature your cotton fiber is. Because apparently those two things make a surprising difference. If the individual fiber is finer, you can fit more of them into the thread of yarn. And what that means is you can make a much stronger yarn. Strong, smooth, and shiny. And then there's the maturity part. Remember from part 1 when we discussed that each cotton starts out as a tiny little plant cell and it just grows and grows and grows and grows? Well, as that cell grows, it builds layers and layers and layers of cellulose into its walls. If the fiber doesn't mature fully, those walls remain insufficient. And that can very much affect how the cotton's going to behave later, especially when it comes to things like processing and dyeing. So, almost like wine, one field could grow the exact same batch, but like the north end of the field could have much better cotton than the south end. Because cotton is an agricultural product, it had a whole life before it became yarn. You know, it had genetics, it was exposed to weather, water availability really mattered, the growing conditions. Even what happens during the harvesting process can affect the feel of the cotton, which means, honestly, we've now reached a slightly ridiculous point in our investigation. But don't worry, we're finally going to take all that cotton into the mill and make things even more complicated. Let's talk about processing cotton. It's finally leaving the field, it's entering the mill. Surely things are going to get a bit more straightforward now. They're not. Because before those fibers can be turned into yarn, they need to first be cleaned, combed, and basically processed. And one of the biggest differences actually happens during the carding and the combing. All cotton that is destined for commercial spinning is going to go through a process known as carding. Imagine what those little balls of cotton look like after they've been harvested and then shoved in these giant bags getting ready for this process. They're going to get tangled, the points are going in every direction. It's going to be a little clumpy and a little knotty. They're certainly not sitting politely in a little row waiting to be processed. And so, the cotton is carded. Giant machines gently brush out all these little tangles. And during this process, it's going to separate and remove any other organic matter that might still be sitting in that bag. However, during this process, the staple lengths are still very much blended. And a few other little irregularities still remain too. And sometimes that can be exactly what we want. In these instances, it can create something that's a little softer, a little matter, and a little bit fluffier. What you're seeing is basically those tiny little fiber ends trying to escape from your yarn. It can feel relaxed and perfectly cottony instead of something that's very polished and produced. However, if we want something that is very soft and very shiny, we're going to take things a next step further. And here's where we comb it. Combing and carding aren't the same thing, although very similar. The carding process essentially just aligns the fibers. The combing is now going to line them up so that they're all perfectly together. And this is where the short little fibers can now be removed. Any tiny tangles and other problems can be picked out. It's like you can imagine a sergeant shouting, "Long ones all, face the same direction." And this now changes the raw material that we're going to send into spinning. So this is when you're going to see combed cotton printed on a label. That's not another species. There's no mysteriously well-combed cotton growing somewhere in a field. It's telling you what happened after the cotton was harvested. But this is where our original problem gets a little bit more interesting. We could theoretically begin with cotton from the same species, even the same staple length, yet still produce two very different batches. By the time that cotton's delivered to our front door in a very neat little skein cake, whatever, it already looks and feels noticeably different. And girl, we still haven't spun them yet. Which is honestly unfortunate because spinning is where things get even more complicated. So let's talk about spinning. We're finally turning the cotton into yarn. And you may be thinking, we've checked the species, we've measured the fibers, we've checked the maturity, we've carded and combed. We've made enough decisions. No, we haven't. Absolutely not, because you can take two very similar cottons and spin them in very different ways and still end up with a completely different thing. One of the most traditional spinning styles is called ring spinning. Basically, what happens is the fibers are drawn out, they're twisted together, they're wound into like a bobbin using what is referred to as a continuous ring and traveler system. What matters to us knitters is what that process is doing to the yarn. It's making those little fibers sit very neatly together, meaning that ring spun cotton is going to be your softer, smoother, more lustrous cotton. Then we've got open end spinning or rotor spinning, which works rather differently. Instead of feeding a continuous strand of already processed cotton through a ring, the fibers are separated and collected inside of a rapidly spinning machine, like a rotary machine. Afterwards, they're then collected and assembled into the yarn. This method is very fast and it's very efficient, and it can produce enormous amounts of cotton, very economical. However, if we look at that yarn under a microscope, we see a completely different structure. They're not sitting together all nice and uniformly, obviously. And this is obviously going to produce the more rustic version. That doesn't make it worse. It just makes it perfect for denim, towels, and everyday textiles, your hardworking ones. This is very useful for that, and this is where a lot of our mainstream cotton goes and how it's processed. And then we have the latest method, the airjet vortex spinning method. It's kind of like that Dyson hairdryer, but for cotton. The fibers are pulled up into this vortex tunnel, and then they're arranged in this sort of like parallel manner. But again, it's changing the architecture and therefore changing the behavior of the fiber. It's slightly changing how smooth, how fuzzy, and how resistant to pilling it's going to end up being. Even the way it feels against your skin. So by this point, you can see how saying I don't like cotton is really actually a very complicated statement to make. Like, okay, but which cotton? Which species? What spinning style? However, there's still more steps because now we need to ply the yarn. We can do single, we can do plied, we can do cable, chainlet, how many twists, mercerized, blended. At this point, we're not choosing cotton, we're interrogating it. Where were you spun and who were you with? But luckily for us, this next part is the part that's especially useful for knitters, because the way that the yarn itself is constructed can completely change what happens to it when we turn it into a fabric. So we have finally spun the yarn. We're done, right? Technically, yes. Unfortunately, for all the Libras in the chat, we still have one more decision to make. Because the way those spun yarns are constructed completely changes what happens to it when we put it on our needles. Take a loosely spun single ply. This means that the fiber was very gently spun and we only have one strand. It can feel wonderfully soft. This can have an incredible drape, but with less twist, holding everything together, it may also be fuzzier. It may also be easier to split and just generally very vulnerable to abrasion. And in a garment, all that softness and movement can come with a very cotton-like surprise. Yes, growth. Because cotton already has very little natural elasticity, like compared to wool. If you give it a loose structure and a lot of weight, i.e. a big garment, and suddenly gravity wins the vote. At the other end, we add more twist and our fiber now becomes more stiff. That can create a fabric that's a little too compact. However, your stitches will look really sharp and defined, but it's not going to feel cloud-like on your skin. Then you take one spun strand, 2, 3, even 4, and you start twisting them all together, and suddenly the yarn starts to develop a very nice personality. She's now strong and cloud-like. And then there's cable spun yarn. Basically what that is already plied yarns get twisted together again. We're essentially plying plies. This is giving us strength. It's the kind of cotton that makes sense for something that needs to hold its shape. Here we're talking about like a bag or, you know, those cute little hats, those bucket hats. You know, we don't want that brim to just hide our eyes. We also have chainlets. Essentially, instead of making one dense solid strand of yarn, the fibers are constructed into little chainlet tubes. If you have ever worked with blown yarn, it's essentially like this. This is creating a lot of space and a lot of air. It's like volume without requiring density, which brings us to one of the most common complaints of cotton. It's so heavy. And yes, cotton can be very heavy. It can be very dense. But I hope at this point we've learned not all cottons are created equally. And this is what's useful for you as a knitter to know, because if you're trying to knit a little summer garment and you go into a yarn store and you just pick up a ball of cotton and you come home and you make something that feels like a denim dish towel, it would have been helpful for you to first know that there was a different option for you. Like, you can actually still knit cables. You just want something that's a little bit rounder and a little bit more lightly plied. If you want something that's very fluid, you need less structure. Oh, that was a long one, wasn't it? Oh wait, I'm not done. We still have to add chemicals. Next up, the mercenaries. Yes, I said mercerized, I meant mercerized. If you're new here, I am very dyslexic. I'm genuinely fighting for my life all the time. It's kind of why my videos are so heavily edited. So, Cotton decided to take a little chemical bath in a solution called sodium hydroxide, also known as caustic soda, under very carefully controlled situations. And yes, it does sound a little bit alarming. But something very interesting happens when this takes place. The fibers swell. If we look at untreated cotton under a microscope, we'll be able to see all the different molecules. Mercerization changes that internal structure completely. I mean, obviously it melts it almost. And this process also makes it significantly more shiny. We can call that luster. Essentially, it just becomes very smooth. It also readily takes dye more easily, which means colors can be a lot more vibrant. It also improves strength and the dimensional qualities. Meaning it makes it a little bit more flexible. If you do a lot of lace work, if you are acrobatic with your needles, then mercerized definitely does have a place for you. We have now covered species, staple length, fineness, maturity, carded or combed, spinning method, yarn construction, mercerized or untreated, and somehow we still have more information to put on that label. Organic cotton is not a fiber type. Organic cotton is, yes, it's finer, it's softer, it's more natural, obviously. I don't know, maybe it was growing listening to whale music or Bach, and it was harvested exclusively under a full moon. But no, that's not what organic cotton is. All it really means is that the cotton was grown and produced under very specific standards. That's the distinction here. It's all of the different species, all the different staple lengths. So if your cotton says 100% organic, it just means that it's followed these particular instructions, like a little gold sticker on your wine bottle. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to behave well on your needles. Does mean that it probably has a good frequency.